The Atlantic Alliance has not seen a rupture like this in decades. Not since the bitter divisions over the Iraq War in 2003, when France and Germany broke with Washington in front of the entire world. Has NATO been this openly, this publicly, and this defiantly split from the United States of America? And this time, the fault line runs directly through the Oval Office. Here is what we know tonight. The Trump administration issued a formal ultimatum to NATO allies, demanding unified support for a hardline posture against Iran, one that analysts describe as a precursor to potential military action. The ultimatum, delivered through back-channel diplomatic pressure and confirmed by senior European officials, asked allied governments to endorse a framework that would place Iran under maximum economic pressure, restrict European trade relationships with Tehran, and align publicly with Washington's position that Iran's nuclear program represents an immediate, existential threat requiring a coordinated military deterrence posture. NATO said no. Not quietly. Not with diplomatic hedging. European alliance members, including France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, formally rejected the framework. Senior officials in Brussels made clear that the alliance would not be conscripted into what one European diplomat, speaking on background, described as a unilateral American confrontation strategy dressed up as collective defense. The White House, by multiple accounts, did not see this coming at the scale it arrived. This is not a minor policy disagreement. This is not the routine friction that surfaces between allies on burden sharing or trade. What happened in the past 72 hours is something fundamentally different. A direct institutional repudiation by America's closest military partners of a presidential directive on one of the most volatile regions on Earth. Iran watched all of it. Tehran's foreign ministry issued a statement within hours of the NATO rejection becoming public. The language was careful, but the message was unmistakable. Iran's leadership interpreted the alliance split as a strategic signal, evidence that the United States does not speak for the Western world when it comes to Iranian policy. That perception alone carries enormous consequences. Consider what is now in motion. A U.S. president who campaigned on projecting maximum strength has just watched his primary military alliance publicly refuse his direction on Iran, a country that has spent 4 decades probing for exactly this kind of fracture. The credibility of American deterrence is now a live question in every capital from Brussels to Beijing. And the diplomatic machinery that has, for decades, kept the NATO alliance functioning as a unified front is now visibly strained in ways that adversaries will exploit. We are going to walk through all of it tonight. The history, the breakdown, the strategy, the consequences, and what comes next. Because what just happened is not simply a news story, it is a turning point. And the decisions made in the coming days will determine whether this fracture is repaired or whether it becomes something far more permanent. If you want to stay ahead of this story as it develops, subscribe to this channel right now. We are covering every development in real time with the depth and analysis this moment demands. This is the story. Let's start at the beginning. To understand why NATO's rejection of the Trump ultimatum carries the weight it does, you have to go back. Not just weeks, not just months. You have to go back decades. Because the collision we are witnessing today between Washington and its European allies over Iran did not materialize overnight. It was built, layer by layer, through decades of diverging strategic interests, competing economic relationships, and fundamentally different threat assessments. Let's build the timeline. 1979, the foundation of the fracture. The modern crisis over Iran begins with the Islamic Revolution, when Ayatollah Khomeini swept the Shah from power in 1979, and Iranian students seized the American embassy in Tehran, the United States, and Iran entered a state of sustained hostility that has never fully resolved. For Washington, Iran became, and has remained, a designated state sponsor of terrorism, a regional destabilizer, and an existential threat to Israel, America's closest Middle Eastern ally. Europe never fully shared that framing. European governments maintained trade relationships with Tehran. They pursued diplomatic engagement, where Washington imposed sanctions. They viewed Iran not simply as a threat to be contained, but as a complex regional power that could, under the right conditions, be negotiated with. That divergence in perspective was manageable for decades, until Iran's nuclear ambitions forced the question onto the global stage. 2003, Iraq and the first major alliance fracture. The Iraq War exposed a fault line inside NATO that had previously remained submerged. France and Germany's public refusal to support the U.S.-led invasion was not merely a policy disagreement. It was a signal that European members of the alliance were willing to break publicly with Washington when they believed American strategy was miscalculated or dangerous. That precedent matters enormously for what we are watching today. 2015. The JCPOA and the illusion of consensus. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, represented the high water mark of transatlantic alignment on Iranian policy. Negotiated under the Obama administration with the full participation of France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, the JCPOA appeared to resolve the central tension. Iran would constrain its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. European governments invested enormous diplomatic capital in that agreement. For them, it was not just a non-proliferation framework. It was proof that multilateral diplomacy worked. 2018, Trump withdraws. Europe refuses to follow. When the first Trump administration unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA in May 2018, the rupture that had been building for decades became impossible to ignore. European signatories, France, Germany, the UK, refused to follow Washington's lead. They attempted, largely unsuccessfully, to preserve the agreement and maintain trade channels with Iran despite crippling U.S. secondary sanctions. The message from Washington to its allies was blunt: fall in line or face economic consequences. The message from European capitals back to Washington was equally clear: we will not subordinate our foreign policy to yours. 2020, the Soleimani assassination and alliance shock. The U.S. drone strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in January 2020 sent shockwaves through European alliance capitals. NATO partners were not consulted. They were not warned. They learned of the strike the same way the rest of the world did, through breaking news alerts. Several NATO governments quietly expressed alarm, not because they mourned Soleimani, but because the unilateral nature of the strike demonstrated that Washington was prepared to take actions with catastrophic escalation potential without any allied consultation whatsoever. 2025, maximum pressure returns. With the return of the Trump administration, maximum pressure on Iran was reinstated and intensified. Sanctions were tightened, diplomatic channels were closed, and the administration began pressing NATO allies to formally align with a posture that many European governments viewed as a deliberate march toward military confrontation. That pressure built throughout late 2025 and into early 2026, until 72 hours ago, when it finally broke, and NATO broke with it. The history made this moment inevitable. The only question now is how deep the damage runs. Now let's get precise. Because in a story this consequential, the details matter enormously. What exactly happened in the 72 hours that shook the Atlantic Alliance? Who said what, to whom, and when? And where do the competing accounts diverge? Here is the breakdown, as best as it can be reconstructed from available reporting, diplomatic sourcing, and official statements. The Ultimatum, Washington's version. According to senior administration officials speaking to American media outlets, the Trump White House did not characterize its communications to NATO allies as an ultimatum. The official framing from Washington was that the United States was requesting allied coordination on what it described as a unified deterrence posture toward Iran's accelerating nuclear enrichment activity. Administration officials pointed to recent International Atomic Energy Agency reports, indicating that Iran had further expanded its uranium enrichment capacity, bringing its breakout timeline, the period required to produce enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon, to what U.S. intelligence assessed as a critically short window. The White House framing was straightforward. This is a collective security issue. Iran is weeks, not months, from nuclear threshold capability. NATO allies must align now or accept shared responsibility for the consequences of inaction. That was Washington's position. European capitals heard something very different. The ultimatum. Europe's version 3 senior European diplomatic sources, cited across multiple international outlets, described the American communication in terms that were considerably more coercive than the White House characterization. According to these accounts, Allied governments were presented with a draft framework document that required them to endorse language explicitly supporting military deterrence options against Iran. Language that several NATO legal and defense teams interpreted as political cover for a potential preemptive military strike. One senior official, speaking anonymously to a major European newspaper, described the communication as containing an implicit deadline. Allies were told, in effect, that the United States intended to move forward with its Iran strategy with or without NATO endorsement, but that failure to endorse would be noted and would have consequences for bilateral relationships with Washington. That framing, sign on or face consequences, is what transformed a policy request into what European governments internally classified as an ultimatum. The rejection, Brussels acts. The formal NATO response was coordinated with unusual speed. Within 48 hours of the American framework being circulated, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom had aligned on a joint position. The three governments, representing the core of European military and diplomatic weight inside NATO, issued coordinated statements rejecting the framework. Their language was diplomatic in tone, but unambiguous in substance. France's foreign ministry stated that France would not endorse any framework that prejudged military options against a sovereign state outside of a UN Security Council mandate. Germany's government, navigating its own domestic political pressures, echoed the French position and added that destabilizing the Persian Gulf region would have direct and severe economic consequences for European energy security. The United Kingdom, traditionally the closest U.S. ally in Europe, issued the most carefully worded statement, but its refusal to endorse the American framework was unambiguous. NATO Secretary General communications during this period were notably cautious, a silence that itself communicated the depth of the internal disagreement. What the evidence shows, and what remains uncertain. Several critical questions remain unresolved. It is not publicly confirmed whether the Trump administration's framework document contained explicit authorization language for military action, or whether European governments overstated that interpretation for diplomatic or domestic political purposes. The IAEA's most recent assessments on Iran's enrichment timeline have not been publicly released in full, and the precise nature of any private communications between the White House and individual NATO heads of government remains, for now, unknown. What is confirmed is this. A formal American request for Allied alignment on Iran policy was made, and NATO's most significant European members refused it, publicly, coordinately, and on the record. In diplomatic terms, that is not a disagreement. That is a rupture. And Tehran, watching every move, has already begun calibrating its response. Section 4. Strategic importance. Step back from the diplomatic language for a moment Step back from the statements, the frameworks, the coordinated rejections, and the White House responses, and ask the question that military strategists and intelligence analysts are asking in every major capital tonight. What does this rupture actually mean? Strategically, militarily, and operationally? The answer is more consequential than most breaking news coverage has captured. Because this is not simply a story about Allied disagreement. This is a story about the structural integrity of the Western deterrence architecture, the interlocking system of alliances, commitments, and credible threat projection that has, for 8 decades, prevented major power conflict and kept the most dangerous regional actors in check. That architecture just developed a visible crack. And the location of that crack, directly over Iran policy, could not be more strategically significant. Why Iran is not a peripheral issue. Iran is not a second-tier geopolitical actor. It is the central organizing power of a regional network that stretches from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Through its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Iran funds, trains, arms, and directs a constellation of proxy forces: Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, and an array of Shia militia networks operating across Iraq and Syria. This network represents the most sophisticated non-state military infrastructure on Earth, and it operates under Iranian strategic direction. Control of this network gives Iran something that very few regional powers possess: the ability to project force and create instability across multiple theaters simultaneously, without deploying a single uniformed Iranian soldier across its own borders. It is a form of strategic leverage that has confounded American and Israeli military planners for decades. Add a nuclear dimension to that architecture, and the strategic calculus changes fundamentally. A nuclear threshold Iran, an Iran that possesses the technical capability to produce a weapon rapidly, even if it has not yet assembled one, is an Iran that can operate its proxy network under a nuclear umbrella. That changes deterrence dynamics across the entire Middle East. It constrains Israeli military options. It complicates American force posture in the Gulf. It emboldens Iranian-aligned actors from Beirut to Sana'a. And it accelerates nuclear hedging behavior among regional rivals. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt have all, at various points, signaled that Iranian nuclear capability would force them to reconsider their own nuclear postures. This is the strategic landscape over which Washington and its NATO allies are now publicly divided. What American military posture requires effective military deterrence of Iran? The kind of deterrence that actually constrains Iranian behavior, rather than simply signaling American resolve, requires allied cooperation at multiple levels. Intelligence sharing between U.S., British, French, and German services provides the early warning architecture that underpins any credible military response. Basing and overflight rights across NATO-aligned Mediterranean and Gulf states are essential for force projection into the region. Coordinated sanctions enforcement by European financial institutions gives economic pressure its teeth. And the political credibility of collective Western resolve is, itself, a deterrent, because it signals to Tehran that any aggressive action triggers a unified, overwhelming response. Every one of those components is now weakened by what happened in the past 72 hours. The geography of consequence. The Persian Gulf is the transit corridor for approximately 20% of the world's oil supply. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point at the Gulf's mouth, flanked by Iranian territory, is the single most strategically sensitive maritime passage on Earth. Iran has repeatedly demonstrated both the capability and the willingness to threaten closure of that strait during periods of maximum pressure. A disruption of Hormuz transit, even a temporary one, would trigger immediate global energy market shock, with cascading economic consequences across every major economy. American naval assets in the Gulf, centered on the Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, represent the primary military guarantee of Hormuz's freedom of navigation. But that guarantee is credible only as long as it is backed by allied political solidarity. The moment adversaries perceive that solidarity fracturing, the calculus around testing American resolve shifts dangerously. The signal Tehran just received. Iranian strategic planners are not passive observers of Western alliance politics. They study it with extraordinary sophistication. And the signal they receive from NATO's rejection of the Trump ultimatum is one of the most valuable pieces of strategic intelligence they could have hoped for, delivered without any covert operation required by the public statements of America's own allies. The signal is this: the United States does not have unified Western backing for its Iran posture. European allies are not prepared to endorse military deterrence options. And the political cost of American escalation within the alliance itself is now demonstrably high. That knowledge does not make Iranian miscalculation more likely. But it makes Iranian confidence, the belief that the Western response to any Iranian provocation will be fractured and delayed, considerably higher than it was 1 week ago. In strategic terms, that shift in Iranian confidence is perhaps the most dangerous immediate consequence of what we witnessed this week. The alliance crack is visible. The adversary has seen it. And the clock, on multiple fronts, is running. When an event of this magnitude unfolds, when the foundational architecture of Western collective security fractures in real time, in public, over one of the most volatile regional conflicts on Earth, the analytical community does not stay silent. Intelligence assessments circulate. Think tanks publish emergency briefings. Former senior officials speak on background. Military analysts update their threat models. What are the experts saying tonight? And what does the intelligence picture actually look like beneath the diplomatic noise? The intelligence community assessment. According to reporting drawn from multiple national security correspondents with sourcing inside the American intelligence community, the current U.S. assessment of Iran's nuclear timeline is more alarming than public statements have conveyed. Intelligence analysts within the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency have, in recent months, revised their estimates of Iran's uranium enrichment capacity upward, concluding that Iran has accumulated sufficient highly enriched uranium to produce the fissile core of a nuclear device faster than previously assessed public timelines suggested. Critically, analysts draw a distinction between possessing fissile material and possessing a deployable weapon. Iran's weaponization capability, its ability to miniaturize a nuclear device, integrate it with a delivery system, and produce a militarily usable weapon, remains subject to significant intelligence uncertainty. But the direction of travel is not in dispute. Iran is closer to nuclear threshold capability today than at any previous point in its history. That assessment is what drove the urgency behind the Trump administration's push for allied alignment. The White House was not operating from a position of manufactured crisis. The underlying intelligence concern is real, documented, and shared, at least partially, by European intelligence services as well. Where the divergence lies is not in the threat assessment, it is in the prescribed response. Think tank and Policy Institute analysis analysts at the International Institute for Strategic Studies have noted that the NATO rejection represents what they characterize as a structural realignment in transatlantic burden sharing on Middle Eastern security. The core argument from European-aligned policy institutes is that American maximum pressure strategy has a documented track record of accelerating rather than constraining Iranian nuclear development. When the JCPOA was abandoned in 2018, Iran's enrichment activity expanded dramatically. The lesson European strategists drew from that sequence was that coercive pressure without a credible diplomatic off-ramp produces the opposite of its intended effect. Analysts at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace have argued that the Trump administration's Iran framework suffers from a fundamental strategic contradiction. It demands allied support for a posture designed to foreclose diplomatic options, while simultaneously expecting those allies to absorb the economic and security consequences of the escalation that posture invites. That contradiction, policy analysts argue, is precisely why European governments refuse to sign on. Military analyst perspectives. Retired senior military officers with direct experience in U.S. Central Command operations have offered a more operationally focused analysis of the alliance rupture. The core concern expressed across multiple analyst commentaries this week is not the diplomatic disagreement itself. Allied friction is a permanent feature of coalition management. The core concern is timing. The window during which military deterrence options against Iran's nuclear program remain viable is, according to these assessments, narrowing. Iranian underground enrichment facilities, particularly those at Fordo, buried deep beneath a mountain in central Iran, are approaching a hardening threshold beyond which conventional military strikes would have significantly reduced effectiveness. The operational clock for any military option, if one were ever to be exercised, is not indefinite. The alliance rupture, military analysts argue, does not simply weaken deterrence in the abstract. It potentially forecloses options that, once closed, cannot be reopened. Academic and policy expert views. Academic specialists in alliance theory and NATO institutional behavior have pointed to a dimension of this crisis that receives insufficient attention in breaking news coverage: the institutional memory problem. NATO's cohesion has historically depended on the belief, shared across all member governments, that the United States exercises strategic leadership with allied consultation built into its decision-making process. That belief, call it alliance trust, is not a fixed asset. It is accumulated through consistent behavior over time and depleted through unilateral action and coercive pressure. Scholars who study alliance cohesion argue that the Trump administration's approach to NATO on Iran policy has drawn down precisely the trust reserves that make collective action possible. When allies feel that consultation is performative rather than genuine, that decisions have already been made in Washington, and allied input is sought only as political cover, the institutional incentive to comply with American requests erodes rapidly. What we witnessed this week, several alliance scholars argue, is not an anomaly. It is the predictable institutional output of a trust deficit that has been accumulating for years. The intelligence gap. Nobody is discussing. There is one dimension of the intelligence picture that has received almost no public attention, and it may be the most consequential of all. European intelligence services, particularly French and German, maintain back-channel communications with Iranian interlocutors that American services under current policy constraints do not. Those channels represent an irreplaceable source of insight into Iranian decision-making, red lines, and negotiating flexibility. They also represent a potential pathway to diplomatic de-escalation that does not currently exist on the American side. If the alliance rupture deepens, if European governments, feeling coerced and dismissed by Washington, reduce their intelligence cooperation with American services, the United States could find itself operating with a significantly degraded picture of Iranian intentions at precisely the moment when accurate intelligence is most critical. That possibility, analysts warn, is not theoretical. It is an operational risk that is already being war-gamed in Washington's intelligence community. The experts have spoken. The picture they paint is not reassuring.